The Veridian Sphere Military Academy floated in the neutral zone between 6 major star systems, which was either a testament to interspecies cooperation or proof that nobody trusted anyone else enough to host the damn thing in their own territory. Probably both. The station itself was a marvel of engineering. If by marvel you meant a grotesque compromise between 17 different architectural philosophies that somehow resulted in corridors that were simultaneously too tall for Quelrians and too short for Hexthari. The temperature fluctuated between freezing and sweltering depending on which sector you wandered into. And the artificial gravity had so many adjustment zones that cadets routinely experienced mild nausea just walking to breakfast. But it was prestigious. Oh, incredibly prestigious. The kind of place where the children of planetary governors rubbed shoulders with the offspring of warlords, fleet admirals, and occasionally, if the rumors were true, actual deposed monarchs trying to rebuild their family's military reputation. Every species with a seat on the Galactic Coalition sent their finest warriors in training here, which meant the Academy was constantly filled with the galaxy's most aggressive, competitive, and frankly, insufferable young people, all trying to prove their species was the apex predator. The hierarchy was unofficial, but universally acknowledged. At the top sat the Theraxians, because of course they did. 7 feet of scaled muscle, redundant organs, the ability to survive in vacuum for up to 3 minutes, and a cultural obsession with honor that made everyone else's warrior traditions look like casual hobbies. Right below them were the Krell Dominion Cadets, insectoid nightmares with 4 arms and reaction times that made them nearly unbeatable in close combat. Then came the Hexthari, the Voss, the Quelrians, and so on down the list in descending order of perceived lethality. Humans occupied a strange middle tier, which baffled absolutely everyone who'd actually bothered to read the reports from first contact. Earth was classified as a Class 9 death world, the kind of planet where evolution had apparently decided to run a sadistic experiment in survival of the fittest. Everything there was either poisonous, predatory, or prone to spontaneous natural disasters. The humans had clawed their way to the top of that nightmare through sheer persistence and an alarming capacity for creative violence. And yet, here at the Academy, they were treated as mid-range threats at best. Kyven Rolth suspected this was because humans looked absurdly fragile. No scales, no exoskeleton, no natural weapons to speak of. Just soft skin, blunt teeth, and those weird flexible joints that seemed like they'd dislocate if you looked at them wrong. He'd seen exactly 3 humans in his entire life, all of them on recruitment holovids, and none of them had impressed him. They were small. Average height for a human male was barely 6 feet, which meant Kyven could look down at them from his full 7'3" frame. Their military dress uniforms looked almost comical, trying so hard to appear intimidating with all those sharp angles and metals, but ultimately just wrapping soft flesh in fancy fabric. Kyven had been at the Academy for 8 months now and had yet to interact with a human cadet. They kept to themselves mostly, training in their own cohort, eating at their own tables. He'd heard rumors, naturally. Whispers in the combat halls about human endurance, about their ability to function on minimal sleep, about something called adrenaline that turned them into temporary berserkers. But rumors were just rumors, usually started by species trying to make their own warriors look better by association. It was the 14th rotation of the training cycle when everything changed. The day started normally enough, which should have been Kyven's first warning. The universe had a sense of humor darker than a Voss spawning pit, and it particularly enjoyed overturning expectations right when you got comfortable. Kyven had aced his tactical simulation that morning, putting him at the top of his cohort for the 3rd week running. His clutch mates back on Theraxis would be proud. More importantly, the academy instructors were starting to notice him, which meant better placement opportunities after graduation. He was feeling good, confident, maybe a little cocky as he headed through the main corridor toward the physical conditioning center, his scales catching the artificial light in a way that he knew looked impressive. Other cadets moved out of his way, which was standard. Theraxians didn't have to push through crowds. Crowds parted for Theraxians. Except when the station's alarm system decided to run an unscheduled drill and 300 cadets from 6 different species all tried to move to their designated emergency stations simultaneously. The corridor became chaos. Quelrians skittered along the walls, using their adhesive pads to bypass the ground traffic entirely. Hextharis simply lowered their heads and charged through like living battering rams. A group of Voss cadets formed a coordinated movement pattern that was admittedly impressive, but completely ignored everyone else's attempts to navigate. And somewhere in the middle of all this, moving against the main flow of traffic because of course he was, came the human. Kyven didn't even see him at first. He was too focused on maintaining his own trajectory, using his size to carve a path through the smaller species. The collision was inevitable in hindsight. 2 bodies moving perpendicular to each other through a space that was rapidly running out of room. They hit shoulder to shoulder, or rather, Kyven's shoulder to the human's upper chest, because height differences. The human stumbled. Pure instinct made Kyven reach out to steady him, a gesture of honor among Theraxians, helping those you'd accidentally wronged. His hand closed around the human's forearm, fingers wrapping around warm skin, and the world stuttered. That was the only way Kyven could describe it later. Reality hiccuped like a hollow vid skipping frames. Temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. His scales, normally excellent conductors of ambient heat, suddenly felt like they were conducting ice water. The human's arm under his grip went rigid, muscles locking in a way that seemed anatomically improbable. And there, under Kyven's palm, something that wasn't quite a tattoo and wasn't quite a scar, pulsed with a light that definitely wasn't natural. The combat mark. Kyven had never seen one up close. He'd heard they existed. Every species in the academy had been given the basic briefing on human cultural practices during orientation. But the briefing had been clinical, detached, the kind of lecture designed to check a box rather than actually inform. Something about humans marking themselves after significant battles. Traditional warrior culture, very quaint. Please respect their customs, moving on to more important topics. The mark itself was beautiful in a deeply unsettling way. It wrapped around the human's forearm in patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Geometric shapes that implied mathematical relationships Kyven didn't have the education to understand. Colors flickered through it. Deep blue, silver, something that might have been red or might have been gold depending on the angle. And it was warm. Despite the sudden drop in ambient temperature, the mark itself radiated heat like a small sun embedded under the skin. The human's face had gone from surprise to pale to something approaching resignation in the span of 3 seconds. His eyes, brown, which Kyven's brain helpfully noted was a common human coloration, locked onto where Kyven's hand still gripped his arm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. "You should probably let go now." Kyven let go. Obviously, he wasn't trying to make whatever this was worse. Except apparently, it was already as worse as it could get. Because the moment his hand lifted, the corridor went silent. Not quiet. Silent. 300 cadets from a dozen different species all stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped making any sound whatsoever, in the space of a single breath. The alarm drill continued its automated sequence somewhere in the background, lights flashing their warning patterns. But nobody paid attention. Every eye in the corridor was fixed on Kyven and the human. Then the whispers started. Quelrians chittered to each other in their clicking language, mandibles working frantically. A pair of Voss cadets backed away slowly, their usually aggressive posture replaced with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The Hexthari were murmuring in their low-frequency bass tones, sounds that Kyven could feel vibrating through his chest plates, more than he could hear them. Even other Theraxians were staring, which was perhaps the most alarming part. Theraxians didn't stare. They assessed, they observed, they studied. They didn't stand around with their mouths slightly open like they were witnessing something forbidden. "What?" Kyven demanded, looking around at the crowd. "It was an accident. I was just—" "That is a binding oath." The voice came from a Quelrian cadet, named something unpronounceable that the translation software rendered as click-shift. She'd moved closer, her four eyes blinking in sequential patterns that Kyven's cultural database helpfully identified as extreme concern. "You touched his combat mark. Do you not understand what you have done?" "I helped him from falling. That's what you're supposed to do when you accidentally collide with someone smaller than?" "Binding. Oath." ClickShift emphasized each word like she was speaking to a particularly slow child. "The mark is not decoration. It is contract. It is law. It is—" She trailed off, searching for the right word in Standard Galactic. "It is witness and judge together. You have created a debt." Kyven looked at the human, who was now studying his own arm with an expression that suggested he was seriously reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. Is she serious? The human laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Unfortunately, yes. Though I was really hoping to get through my entire academy tenure without this particular cultural nightmare coming up." He looked up at Kyven, and there was something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. "You're Theraxian, right? Strong honor culture, valued social bonds, whole thing about maintaining face in front of your clutchmates?" "Yes. But what does that have to do with—" "Then you're really going to hate the next part." The human sighed and held up his marked arm. The patterns were still shifting, still glowing faintly. "I'm Declan Reeve, by the way. 3rd Cohort, Human Tactical Division. And you just triggered about 3,000 years of extremely stupid human tradition that nobody has figured out how to undo." The crowd was growing. More cadets were arriving, drawn by the commotion or perhaps by some invisible signal that interesting drama was unfolding. Kyven spotted at least 2 cadets with recording devices active, which meant this was going to be all over the Academy's social networks within the hour. His clutchmates back home would see this. His family would see this. The instructors were probably already getting notifications. "I need an adult," Kyven muttered. "You are an adult," ClickShift pointed out helpfully. "We are all adults. That is why we are at Military Academy." "I need an older adult. A more experienced adult. Someone who knows how to fix this." "Nobody can fix this," a Voss cadet called out from the crowd. "Once the mark is touched in aid, the bond forms. It is known." "It is known," several other voices echoed, which was deeply unhelpful. Declan was still looking at his arm with that resigned expression. "Look, let's not do this in the middle of the corridor. The drill is going to end in about 2 minutes, and then instructors are going to show up wondering why half the station's cadets are clustered in one spot. Can we take this somewhere more private?" Kyven wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers immediately, but the human had a point. He nodded stiffly, trying to maintain some dignity despite the situation. My cohort's common room should be empty right now. Lead the way. The crowd parted for them as they walked, which would have been gratifying under any other circumstance. Instead, it just felt ominous. Cadets whispered as they passed, making gestures that ranged from respectful to outright protective. A Hexthari cadet actually bowed slightly as Declan walked by, which made no sense whatsoever. Humans were mid-tier at best. Why would a top-tier predator species show respect? Unless Kyven had fundamentally misunderstood something very important about humans. The Theraxian common room was indeed empty, probably because all his clutchmates were still wherever they'd ended up during the drill. Kyven sealed the door behind them and turned to face Declan, who had settled himself on one of the reinforced benches with the ease of someone who'd completely accepted his fate. "Explain," Kyven demanded. "All of it. What is a binding oath? Why does everyone seem terrified of it, and how do we undo it?" Declan leaned back against the wall, his marked arm resting on his knee where the patterns continued their subtle movement. Okay, brief history lesson. Humans have been marking themselves after significant events for about as long as we've had skin and artistic expression. Different cultures, different reasons, different methods. Tattoos, scarification, branding, the whole range. Mostly it was decorative or commemorative. Mostly? Mostly. Declan's expression darkened slightly. Then came the Cascade Wars. You probably haven't heard of them. They were an Earthside conflict, ended about 15 years before First Contact. Started as a regional dispute, escalated into a global near-extinction event. Biological weapons, nuclear exchanges, entire cities glassed. Really brought out the worst in us as a species. Kyven sat down across from him, his earlier anger fading into something more like morbid curiosity. And this mark. During the wars, a group of human soldiers started marking themselves in a specific way after surviving impossible odds. Not just as commemoration, as a kind of pact. A recognition that they'd looked death in the face and death had blinked first. The marks were done using a specific technique, specific materials, and most importantly, specific neurological targeting. Neurological targeting? Declan nodded. Humans have a lot of weird neural pathways left over from our evolutionary history. Fight or flight responses, adrenaline dumps, stress-triggered time dilation, that sort of thing. Whoever developed the combat mark technique figured out how to tie the marking process directly into those pathways. The mark becomes psychically active. Not in the way you're thinking. We're not telepaths. But the mark creates a kind of permanent awareness, a connection to that moment of survival. That sounds horrifying. It really is. Declan agreed cheerfully. But it worked. Soldiers with combat marks had better battlefield awareness, faster reaction times, stronger resilience to psychological trauma. The marks spread through the military faster than command could track. By the end of the wars, maybe 20,000 people had them. Most of those people died in the final exchanges. The ones who survived carried the marks, and the traditions that came with them, into the post-war reconstruction. Kyven was starting to see where this was going, and didn't like it one bit. And one of those traditions involved people touching the marks? Bingo! Declan flexed his marked arm, making the patterns shift more obviously. In the original tradition, touching someone's combat mark was a challenge, a way of saying, I acknowledge what you survived, and I believe I could survive it too. It was a formal dueling declaration, very dramatic, very stupid, led to a lot of unnecessary deaths until the practice mostly died out. Mostly. Mostly, but there was an exception. If you touched the mark by accident, particularly while offering aid, it created a different kind of bond. A debt bond. The logic being that if you were willing to help someone without knowing who they were or what they'd survived, you had proven yourself honorable, and the marked person owed you a life debt in return. Kyven felt his scales ripple in agitation, a Theraxian stress response. That seems unnecessarily complicated. Welcome to human tradition. We're not known for keeping things simple. Declan's expression softened slightly. Look, I know this is a lot. I didn't ask for this either. I got this mark during the final year of the wars. I was 17, part of a civilian defense unit in what used to be called New Melbourne. Our sector was hit by a biological weapon. I survived. 3,000 other people didn't. The mark was done by a retired soldier who'd made it through even worse, and he didn't exactly ask for permission first. Said it would help me survive whatever came next. Did it? Honestly, I have no idea. I'm still alive, which is something. But the mark is permanent. Can't be removed without killing the person wearing it. It's too tied into our neural structure. And apparently, despite my very best efforts to ignore it, it's still psychically active enough to trigger all the old traditions. Kyven stood and began pacing, which was easier than sitting still with this much anxiety coursing through his system. So, what does this debt bond actually mean? What am I obligated to do? In traditional terms, you've claimed a life debt, which means I owe you my life. The bond can only be resolved in one of three ways. First, I can release you from the debt voluntarily, which acknowledges that the aid you gave was freely offered and requires no recompense. Second, we can engage in mutual combat where I prove I don't actually need anyone's help and can survive on my own merits. Third, and least commonly, we can complete a shared trial that demonstrates we're equals despite the circumstances of the bond's creation. And if we do nothing? Declan winced. The bond strengthens over time. It starts as a minor psychic connection. I can vaguely sense where you are on the station. You probably feel a subtle pull toward where I am. If left unresolved, it intensifies. Eventually, we'd be aware of each other's emotional states, physical condition, immediate danger. It's not telepathy, but it's close enough to be deeply uncomfortable for both parties. That is unacceptable. Agreed. Which is why we need to resolve it sooner rather than later. Declan stood as well, meeting Kyven's eyes with a directness that was probably meant to be reassuring, but instead just highlighted how serious this was. The easiest solution is the first one. I release you from the debt. Tradition satisfied, bond dissolved. Everyone moves on with their lives. Kyven stopped pacing. That sounds ideal. Let's do that. There's a catch. Of course there is. The release has to be done in front of witnesses, specifically witnesses from both our cultures who can verify that the release is genuine and freely given. It's a formal ceremony, takes about an hour, requires specific ritual elements. And it has to be done within a lunar cycle of the bond's creation, or the window closes and we're stuck with options 2 or 3. A lunar cycle, 28 standard days. Kyven could work with that. Fine. We'll arrange the ceremony, gather the witnesses, get this resolved. Problem solved. Declan's expression suggested it was not, in fact, going to be that simple. There's another catch. The release ceremony requires me to publicly acknowledge that I needed your help, that I was vulnerable, and that you acted with honor when you could have exploited that vulnerability. For most humans, that's no problem. But my specific mark, He paused, choosing his words carefully. The circumstances under which I received it make the release ceremony extremely difficult psychologically. The mark is tied to survivor's guilt, to the memory of failing to save others. Acknowledging vulnerability in a public setting triggers all of that trauma. I've seen people with combat marks have complete psychological breakdowns during release ceremonies. But you'll do it anyway. It wasn't a question. Kyven could see the determination in the human's posture, the set of his jaw. I'll try. But I can't guarantee I won't have a panic attack halfway through, which would invalidate the ceremony, and we'd have to start over. And if I have too many failures, the window closes anyway. Declan ran his free hand through his hair, a very human gesture of frustration. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. The success rate for combat mark release ceremonies is about 60%. 40% of the time, we end up at option 2 or 3. Mutual combat or shared trial. Right. And before you suggest it, mutual combat isn't great for either of us. If I win, you're honor-bound to acknowledge that I bested you, which will hurt your reputation in Theraxian circles. If you win, I'm honor-bound to acknowledge that I'm not worthy of carrying the mark, which triggers its own set of psychological consequences. Plus, there's the whole issue of me maybe dying in the attempt, which would be unfortunate. Kyven found himself almost smiling despite the situation. Your gift for understatement is noted. It's a coping mechanism, works better than screaming. Declan settled back onto the bench. The shared trial option is actually not terrible, all things considered. The Academy has a specific protocol for it, since this isn't the first time a debt bond has been formed on station. We'd enter the resolution circle, face a synchronized combat trial against Academy drones, and demonstrate that we can function as equals in high-stress conditions. Success means the bond is satisfied and dissolves naturally. Failure means we try again until we succeed or the window closes. And if the window closes with the bond unresolved? Then we're stuck with it permanently, which means you'd spend the rest of your life with a low-level psychic connection to a human you barely know, and I'd spend mine knowing I'm responsible for binding someone against their will to an obligation they didn't ask for. Declan met his eyes again. I've had this mark for 8 years. I've never formed a debt bond before. I've been extremely careful to avoid situations where someone might accidentally trigger it. The fact that it happened anyway is just the universe's way of reminding me that I don't get to control everything. There was a weight to those words that spoke of harder experiences than Kyven had initially assumed. He reassessed his first impression of the human, small, fragile, unimpressive, and tried to overlay it with this new information. Survivor of a near-extinction event, carrier of a psychically active combat mark, someone who'd spent 8 years carefully managing a condition that could fundamentally alter someone else's life with a single accidental touch. You must hate this, Kyven said quietly. I hate that you got dragged into it. I hate that I couldn't prevent it. But I don't hate you, if that's what you're asking. Declan shrugged. You did exactly what a decent person would do in that situation. Helped someone from falling. That's admirable, not contemptible. The fact that our respective biologies and cultural traditions turned it into a binding magical contract is not your fault. Magical contract. That was one way to describe it. Kyven felt his earlier anger fading into something more complicated. This wasn't the human's fault either, not really. Just two people caught in circumstances neither of them had chosen, trying to figure out the least damaging way forward. So, what do we do? Kyven asked. First, we try the release ceremony. I'll contact the human cultural liaison and get the ritual elements arranged. You'll need to find Theraxian witnesses who can verify your honor, which shouldn't be hard given your academy standing. We'll set it up for as soon as possible, give me time to mentally prepare, and hope I can make it through without breaking down. And if you can't, then we move to option 3, the shared trial, which means we need to start training together immediately, because the resolution circle doesn't care about our feelings and will cheerfully kill us both if we don't have perfect synchronization. Declan stood again, rolling his shoulders like he was preparing for physical exercise. Either way, you and I are going to be spending a lot of time together over the next 28 days. Might as well get used to each other. Kyven found himself nodding despite the absurdity of the situation. My clutchmates are going to have questions. Everyone is going to have questions. The Academy rumor network has probably already produced 17 different versions of what happened, each more dramatic than the last. We should probably get ahead of that before someone decides I've declared a blood feud against all Theraxians or something equally stupid. Do humans actually do blood feuds? Not officially, but give us enough time and poor communication and we'll invent them on the spot. We're creative like that. Despite everything, Kyven laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more surprise than genuine amusement. But it felt good. Better than the anxiety that had been building since the moment his hand touched that mark. You're strange, human. Declan, if we're potentially going to be psychically bonded for life, you should probably use my name. Declan, then. I'm Kyven Rolth, and this is the strangest first meeting I've ever experienced. Same. Though I have to admit, your honor-bound helping instinct is kind of refreshing. Most species would have let me fall and then complained that I was in the way. That would have been dishonorable. And now you're stuck in a debt bond because you chose honor over convenience. The universe really does have a sick sense of humor. They stood there for a moment, human and Theraxian, bound together by accident and ancient tradition in equal measure. Kyven found himself studying Declan more carefully now, looking past the initial impression of fragility. The human held himself with a kind of careful control that came from managing constant pain or psychological stress. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that Kyven had seen in veteran soldiers. The look of someone who'd seen too much and survived anyway. And the mark on his arm continued its subtle movement, patterns shifting in response to some internal rhythm that Kyven couldn't begin to guess at. We should probably face the rumors before they get completely out of hand, Kyven said finally. And I need to contact my clutch leader to explain what happened before she hears it from someone else. Fair. I should probably also contact the human cohort coordinator, and maybe the Academy counseling service. Definitely the counseling service. Declan moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened. You seem like a decent person. You didn't deserve to get caught up in humanity's weird psychic warrior traditions. And you seem like someone who's been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Perhaps the universe thought we could both use some perspective. Declan smiled at that, a genuine expression that made him look younger than Kyven had initially assumed. That's a very optimistic interpretation. I hope you're right. They left the common room together, and if Kyven was more aware of Declan's presence than he had been before, a subtle pull at the edge of his consciousness, like knowing where north was without checking a compass. He chose not to mention it. The bond was already forming. They had 28 days to resolve it. 28 days to either break a connection neither of them wanted or prove they were equals despite every biological and cultural difference between them. Kyven had faced combat simulations, political negotiations, and enough academic pressure to crack most species. Somehow, He suspected the next 4 weeks were going to be more challenging than all of that combined. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely a disaster. The universe had a strange way of teaching lessons, and Kyven had always been an excellent student. Even if the curriculum this time involved accidentally binding himself to a human with a psychically active combat mark and a smile that suggested he'd survived things that would have broken lesser beings. This was going to be interesting, or fatal. Possibly both. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.